Well, Alan, it is wonderful to be here. I want to thank you and Tom and the Foundation for giving me this platform and for assembling this distinguished and knowledgeable audience. I should, before I continue, acknowledge my distinguished friends and former parliamentary colleagues, former Senator Nick Minchin, former government leader in the Senate. We miss you, Nick. We really, really do miss you. And Stuart MacArthur, the former member for Corangamite and long-term government whip. We miss you as well, Stuart. Both of you have made a wonderful contribution to our parliament and our country, and it's good that you continue to do so in different capacities. But if I could summarise what I intend to say at much greater length in a few words, what I intend to say tonight is that it's time to pull out of Paris. That's what I intend to say. Because that is what's causing our problems. Why are we inflicting so much damage on ourselves? Because we think that Paris makes us do it. Well, if something is making us do something that is counterproductive, damaging, futile, get out of that which is making you do it. So that's a little executive summary, if you like, of my remarks. Because this is a lecture in honour of Professor Bob Carter, let me begin by saying that it takes character to do what's right, and it takes courage to disagree with your peers. And on this score, Bob Carter was a good and brave man, whose memory we should honour and whose example we should strive to emulate. As Professor Carter found, and later his James Cook University colleague Peter Ridd also, this is an age that enthusiastically promotes social diversity, but often demands intellectual conformity. Neither of them, however, ever let the desire for status impede the search for truth. As Bob told MPs in 2015, science does not operate by consensus. It is often best progressed by mavericks. And as he pointed out in his book, Climate the Counter-Consensus, sometimes we need to trust authority less and our own brains more. So, what could be a more fitting occasion for scepticism about green religion and its policy ramifications than an address in Professor Carter's honour? In Roman times, grapes were grown in northern England. In the Middle Ages, crops were grown in Greenland. And in the 17th century, ice fairs were held in London on the frozen River Thames. So climate change is real, all right. For me, the issue has always been, what role does man play? Is carbon dioxide the key climate factor, and what might best be done to deal with it? Now, in government, I thought that we should be prepared to pay up to $1 billion a year to cut emissions through the taxpayer-funded Emissions Reduction Fund. I never thought that we should have to pay the $10 billion or so that Labor collected through the carbon tax, and that's why my government abolished it, and in so doing delivered an immediate cut in electricity bills of 10%. My government did set a 2030 emissions reduction target on the basis that this was more or less what could be achieved without new government programs and without new costs on the economy. Because there was no advice then to the effect that it would take a clean energy target or a national energy guarantee to get there. Our intention then was to monitor developments and in the meantime to rely on market forces to make energy use efficient and on the Emissions Reduction Fund to keep overall emissions heading down at the lowest possible cost. My government never put emissions reduction ahead of the well-being of families and the prosperity of industries, because as I've said all along, you don't improve the environment by damaging the economy. I have never thought that reducing emissions should be a fundamental goal of policy, just something that's worth doing if the cost is modest. I have never thought that climate change was, to quote Kevin Rudd, the great moral challenge of our generation. It was an issue, that's all. And at least on the actual changes we've seen far, not a very significant one compared to man's inhumanity to man, maintaining and improving living standards, and even to many other environmental issues, such as degraded bush and waterways, particulate pollution, water quality in the third world, deforestation and urban overcrowding. After all, the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide from roughly 300 to 400 parts per million over the last century has not had dramatic consequences. Storms are not more severe, droughts are not more prolonged, floods are not greater, and fires are not more intense than a century ago, despite hyperventilating reportage and over-the-top claims from Green politicians. Sea levels have hardly risen, and temperatures are still below those of the medieval warm period. Over time, temperature change seems to correlate rather more with sunspot activity than with carbon dioxide levels. And even if carbon dioxide, a naturally occurring trace gas that's necessary for life, really is the main climate villain, Australia's contribution to mankind's emissions is scarcely more than 1%. Of course, we should treat the planet with respect, as it's the only one we've got. But it would be the height of folly to suppress living standards, to shrink industries, and to export jobs and emissions in what was merely a moral gesture. Yes, egged on by media scare stories and attention-seeking academics, the public are inclined to believe that something is happening to climate and that something needs to be done. But our children won't thank us when their power bills keep soaring and their jobs keep going offshore in a futile bid to make the world imperceptibly cooler for our grandchildren. Now, since my time as PM, there have been 4 big developments. Post the carbon tax repeal, power prices have quickly resumed their inexorable rise and have now doubled in a decade. Gas prices have increased almost as much, and with too much of our gas under export contract and green bans on new exploration and extraction, that's made the power squeeze worse. Selective blackouts have become relatively common, with most of South Australia going dark for 24 hours because the wind blew too hard and the interconnector went down. This bitter experience of expensive and unreliable power driving out of the system cheap and reliable power and making the system dangerously unstable, had it occurred earlier, would have made the renewable energy target much more renegotiable, perhaps to the point of abolishing all subsidies for new wind farms. And fourth, the biggest change, America has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Now, when the world's leading country withdraws, it can hardly be business as usual. Our 2015 target, after all, was based on the agreement being, I quote, applicable to all. Absent America, my government would not have signed up to the Paris Treaty, certainly not with the current target. And what wasn't widely grasped even then is the impact of emissions policy on economic performance. Reducing emissions may or may not change the climate ever so slightly decades hence, but it sure has consequences for the way we live now. Yes, we can substantially reduce emissions, but if we do, we can't expect power prices not to rise, and we can't expect energy-intensive industries not to close. Yes, we can favour renewable energy, but don't expect energy that's cheap while it's there not to drive out energy that's there all the time, unless a strong reliability requirement is placed on it. And as the business leaders in Canberra last week to discuss energy policy made crystal clear, we cannot go on as we are. A few weeks back, high demand on cold days next to no renewable energy, and planned and unplanned outages in ageing New South Wales power plants meant that the wholesale power price spiked to $14,000 a megawatt hour, and the Tomago aluminium smelter was forced to stop 3 times in a week. As the head of Tomago said, you can't run a smelter on weather-dependent power, and you can't run one on baseload gas either, because it's too expensive. But this is our future under the National Energy Guarantee, because the emissions reduction requirement means more wind and less coal, and the reliability requirement means more gas and more demand management, as it's now called. This is the predicament we're in, because successive governments have claimed to help the planet by subsidising renewable energy and by imposing emissions reduction targets. So now we want even more renewable energy, up from 23% to perhaps 36% under the government and 50% under Labor, as well as even higher emissions reduction targets. But isn't one of the definitions of insanity doing the same thing and expecting a different result? Now, one of the most important laws of politics is beware the unintended consequences of what seems like a good idea at the time. I'm not sure that the Howard government fully anticipated where the renewable energy target would lead when it first made the decision to impose one. I certainly didn't anticipate, as Prime Minister, how the aspirational targets we agreed to at Paris would in different hands become binding commitments. I didn't anticipate how agreeing to emissions that were 26% lower in 2030 than in 2005 would subsequently become a linear progression of roughly equal cuts every year over the next decade. But now that we are more alive to all the consequences of combining energy policy with emissions policy, and now that we do understand that this will define our economy for decades to come, there is no excuse for getting it wrong again. If we surrender our main comparative economic advantage, cheap power, in what turns out to be a mere gesture because total emissions keep increasing and other countries have either made no commitments to cuts or don't keep them, future generations will judge this one very harshly indeed. If the country with the world's largest readily available reserves of coal, gas and uranium continues to inflict upon itself some of the world's highest power prices, future generations will surely shake their heads in perplexity at such deliberate self-harm. Now, I can understand why the government would like to crack the so-called trilemma of keeping the lights on, getting power prices down and substantially reducing emissions. It's just that there is no plausible evidence at all that all three can be done at the same time. And if you read the National Energy Guarantee documentation, there's a few lines about lower prices, there's a few pages about maintaining supply, and there is page after impenetrable and turgid page about reducing emissions. So the government is kidding us when it says that it's all about reducing price. It's kidding us because there's an emissions reduction target and a reliability target, but no price target whatsoever. It is in fact a telling indicator of priorities that the official design document recommends a $10 million maximum fine for failing to maintain reliability, but a $100 million maximum fine for failing to maintain emissions reduction. So to the designers of this policy, over-emitting that no one will even notice is apparently 10 times more serious than causing blackouts that could plunge a whole state into darkness. All the National Energy Guarantee claims to do to reduce prices is, and I quote, provide investment certainty because this supposedly will mean more investment, more competition, and then lower prices. But each year, generators will have to lower their emissions and not increase their emissions intensity, and that favours all forms of power except the cheapest, namely coal. The reliability requirement might keep coal in for a time, but the emissions reduction requirement will mean that coal keeps shrinking while wind and gas keep expanding. So on my reading, the only certainty that the National Energy Guarantee as it stands would provide is the certainty of emissions reduction. Each year, providers will be required to reduce emissions by a set amount and to meet reliability standards through a complex web of contracts between providers and big consumers, monitored by a plethora of bureaucracies: the Australian Energy Regulator, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and the Energy Security Board, amongst others. There is a procurer of last resort who's supposed to access reliability and emergency reserve traders, but it's far from clear who exactly will ultimately be responsible for providing the power for this market to operate, as opposed to forecasting, measuring, monitoring and policing the power that this heavily corrupted market is supposed to allocate. The National Guarantee is not a carbon tax, its proponents say, but it is a system of compulsory carbon constraint with heavy penalties for non-compliance. And the emissions accounting, reporting and compliance procedures bear an uncanny resemblance to the tax regime, complete with infringement notices that the energy regulator can issue to people who have, quote, the option of paying a penalty in full without there being admission of breach. The government says that it's technology agnostic, but clearly investing $12 billion in Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro, plus billions more into sundry renewable grants and loans, is bias against coal. The government says that it wants the electricity market to work, but plainly it didn't trust the market to deliver pumped hydro and has spent massively to make it part of the system. The government says that it wants to deliver certainty, but the only certainty is that any national energy guarantee that's approved by the state Labor premiers at COAG will be massively ramped up to deliver even more emissions reduction under the next Labor government. Now, after the Prime Minister and ministers spent months quite rightly attacking the Labor Party for plunging South Australia into darkness with a 50% renewable energy target, it's remarkable that the government now wants an energy policy that's acceptable to the state Labor premiers and is so keen for a deal, the party room will be expected to endorse whatever emerges from COAG. Now, to be clear, the National Energy Guarantee could be improved if it had a price target as well as an emissions target, if the emissions reduction trajectory was backloaded, as MPs were told it would be, and if the guarantee of keeping the lights on didn't involve making people switch them off. But it is bordering on the bizarre that a country which is a source of energy security to others is now envisaging power rationing, not as a rare and unfortunate aberration, but as an accepted part of what is supposed to be an energy guarantee. So really, the only way to make the proposed new system affordable and reliable is to supplement it with guaranteed baseload power. And as the 1,000+ new coal-fired plants opening in Asia and also in Germany testify, coal remains the cheapest form of reliable power, but the capital cost of a new plant means that no business will touch one because of political risk. This isn't market failure, but regulatory failure. And because government is the only entity that faces no political risk and little market risk, the government should not palm off to the market fixing the problem that governments have created. A good start to real change would be to threaten compulsory acquisition of the Liddell coal-fired power station so that it can be kept running until new high-efficiency, low-emissions plants can be brought online. The now federal government-owned Snowy already runs gas-fired power plants as well as hydro ones, so there's no reason why it couldn't add to its thermal capacity by building some coal-fired plants to guarantee supply and to drive down price. An alternative might be to go to the market seeking the best bids for the provision of 2,000 megawatts of 24/7 baseload power for the next 30 years, with the government bearing any carbon price risk. But one way or another, it will be up to the government, this government, to make sure that old coal-fired power stays in the system and that new baseload power comes in to replace it. After all, a government that can build Snowy 2.0 to provide high-cost firming capacity, but can't or won't build Hazelwood 2.0 to provide low-cost baseload power for the next half-century and to keep the market honest, has an ideological fixation or at least a consistency deficit. To be consistent with the government's 2013 mandate, the National Energy Guarantee would need recasting to prioritise affordability and reliability ahead of emissions reduction, and it would need supplementing by government guaranteed provision of baseload power. So yes, these are strange times in Canberra, when there's a hullabaloo over modest tax cuts that only take effect fully in 6 or 7 years' time, while mandatory emissions cuts that start sooner, that mean more for the economy and whose ramifications will be virtually impossible to reverse, are expected more or less to be waved through. Liddell's closure in scarcely 3 years' time will leave an 850 megawatt reliability gap in the system. That's what the Australian Energy Market Operator tells us. Yet it's more or less taken for granted that there can be no new coal-fired power stations built now. So we're not just sleepwalking towards deindustrialising our economy. We're jogging towards disaster, because no one wants to be the first to say that the emperor has no clothes. As long as we remain in the Paris Agreement, which is about reducing emissions, not building prosperity, all policy touching on emissions will be about their reduction, not about our well-being. It's this emissions obsession that's at the heart of our power crisis, and it's this that has to end for our problems to ease. I know that ignoring international agreements as soon as it's inconvenient to keep them is not the Australian way. To our credit, we try to say what we mean and to do what we say. We're not like Canada, Germany and all the other EU countries which make virtue signalling climate commitments that they then cheerfully ignore. And when they visited Parliament House the other day, business leaders described Labor's 45% emissions reduction target as economy wrecking. But then they added, sotto voce, even meeting the government's 26% target would be challenging. They all said that they supported the national guarantee. And then came the but, and as always, it's the but that really counts. But what they expect of it is 24/7 availability of dispatchable baseload power and internationally comparative prices, while still trying to achieve the Paris targets. Their concern was the economic dislocation already caused by our current climate policy, and to the extent that they supported the new one, it was as the least bad way to deliver even more emissions reduction while minimising the impact on jobs and growth. Yet nothing at all that Australia does to reduce emissions will make the slightest difference to climate, as even the chief scientist admitted last year. Of global emissions, China is responsible for 28%, America 15%, Europe 11%, India 7%, and Australia, you said 1.5%, Tom. When I last looked, it was 1.3%, a puny 1.3%. Now, a 26% cut to 1.3% is a statistical blip. So why not scale back our cut to 20% or to 15% or to zero or to whatever would actually be achieved in 2030 through normal business cost cutting and efficiencies, plus whatever is delivered through the Emissions Reduction Fund. Of the four biggest emitters, China and India have made no Paris commitment to reduce their total emissions, and America has now pulled out. So when three of the four biggest emitters have no Paris reduction target at all, why should we? Especially now that we can start to count the cost, not just through more expensive and less reliable power, but down the track in more expensive cars and in culled herds. Knowing what we now know, we would not have made the Paris Agreement. So now that we do know, we should get out of it. If we wouldn't have done it, had we known, we shouldn't be in it now that we do. As things stand, the government has guaranteed, not just promised, it's guaranteed, that prices will come down and that the lights will stay on while emissions reductions are achieved. Especially if another government is in office and electricity prices rise or the power fails, most assuredly it will be this government's fault, because the National Energy Guarantee was supposed to fix everything. So withdrawing from the Paris Agreement that is driving the National Energy Guarantee would be the best way to keep prices down and employment up, and to save our party from a political legacy that could haunt us for the next decade at least. Far from wrecking the government, MPs worried about energy policy are trying to save it with a policy that would be different from Labor's and would give voters the affordable and reliable power they want. So, Alan Moran, to you and to the Australian Environment Foundation, thank you for all of your work to keep genuine science before our consciousness. To you, Anne Carter, thank you for supporting and encouraging your wonderful husband in the work that he did. To academics, honest academics like Peter Ridd, thank you for putting up with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The important thing today is that good people tell the truth. The important thing today is that good people do not lose courage and do not lose heart. And it's particularly important that people never put position ahead of principle. I've seen far too much of that in recent times.